The broken tower of Winterfell wore its years like wounds, stones slipped and blackened, ivy threading the fissures, narrow windows gaping like empty eyes. Catelyn had always told her children to keep away from it. She told them many things in a household of cold courtyards and warm fires, little rules to inch winter back. Keep your cloaks tight, oil your leathers, mind your knives, don't race across the hall, take with you a companion, speak truth, take your meals. But the one she repeated most lived in the center of her worry. Do not climb. Bran did not listen because he was made of something that ascended, small hands and eager breath, the world tugging him upward as if sky were a hearth and the gaps in the stone were steps only he could see. She had seen him twice already that afternoon, a flash of brown tunic and flying limbs on the inner ward's wall walk, a shadow that flickered in a battlement's mouth. She had scolded him that morning, not sharply, never sharply, not with Bran, pressing the crown of his head to her breast as if she might keep him with pressure and warmth. He had grinned and she had given up, then remembered that giving up ended with funerals. It was Jon Arryn's death that brought King Robert riding north, but it woke something else in her, the shiver that told a mother winter was nearer than it looked and change ran with long legs. Afternoon washed Winterfell's stones in pallid light. The gods would whispered, servants pressed by the king's appetite. When in knots across the yard, two boys lugging a cask of ale as big as one of them, a girl with flour dusting her cheeks, a cook with an armful of herbs and a face full of scold. The royal party's laughter bounced off the walls, princely and careless. Somewhere, Robert roared for more pies. Catelyn moved across this busy hive like a candle passes through wind, steady, intent, resisting drafts. She had left Ned in the Godswood. He was measured there, taking breath and counsel from trees no man tended. She had left him because there were linens to replace and new banners to hang, and Arya to chide from the kitchens, and Sansa to rescue from a drift of southern ladies who remarked on her hair with bright eyes and pinching fingers. And because Bran was missing, he would go for the tower he knew was forbidden. Everyone desired what walls made forbidden. Catelyn had known that as a girl in Riverrun, following lordling boys across the red stones to look down at the river's twins. Her father said that to forbid was to call. She should have forbidden nothing. She should have walked with him, said a second rule. If you must climb, let me watch. She found the stair by habit, tight and curling, the stone worn by 1,000 feet that belonged to 1,000 days. Halfway up, she saw where a block had slipped and someone, foolish and kind, had wedged driftwood under it to steady the tread. The wood was coated with old grease, footprints in the dust. Her heart quickened. Bran! The echo returned small and empty. She lifted her skirts and climbed, breath shallowing as the space narrowed. At the top, the corridor straightened, a strip of shadow ending in a door with rust at its hinges and iron that had gritted in her hands since she was a girl. Voices came from behind the door, low, quick, entangled. Laughter, not Bran's. She should have turned back. She should have run. Her mind made a ledger of should, but her hand was already on the iron and her son was on the other side of a forbidden thing. She pushed it open to a slice, saw at once the pale gold of hair in a dim room and the spill of a blouse and a man's back, bare and muscled. The woman sat on a table, skirts hitched, her legs around the man's waist. There was no mistake to their intimacy, and in the same instant Catelyn recognized them. The queen, her hands in her brother's hair, twins in body and sin. And beyond them, the window with no lattice, and Bran at its mouth like a startled swallow. His body was half out on the ledge, his fingers searching stone, his face turned away, eyes welded to what his mother had seen. He was full of the awful knowledge of adults that topples childhood. The queen's gaze flicked, and she saw Catelyn. Her mouth opened, not in fear, but in calculation. The man turned, handsome and amused, and took all of it in. The open door, the woman frozen there with her breath in her throat, the boy on the sill. His face altered a hair's breadth. Something like pity moved through it and died. Catelyn's voice came raw, the only thing she could make. Bran! He looked at her. He flinched. Fingers lost purchase. Everything that followed happened inside a heartbeat stretched so thin it became a thread and sang. The queen's lips formed a name. The golden man moved with a grace too quick for thought. Catelyn surged forward. Bran's heel slipped. His small hands scrabbled at stone. Catelyn reached the window and seized him beneath the arms, catching as he slid, her back to the void. The golden man reached them with long strides and put his hands on Bran's shoulders from behind, cold and strong and wrong, and said something softly, almost kindly, as if he put a horse down. Catelyn turned and drove her nails into his wrist. He jerked, not in pain but in annoyance. Then the world fell. She went backward. Bran came with her, and still she clutched him, twisting so that his head would find her chest, her arms making a nest of flesh and bone. There was a gasp, a rush of wind, the bright shock of sky and wall and then sky again, the tower hurrying past like a gray river, the peculiar lightness of falling matched with the heaviness of love, the thought, Ned, and then she struck. Stone is not merciful. It did not leave any piece of her soft enough to get up. The crack of it went out like a bell. Bran lay across her, small and stunned, eyes open as if he had been caught mid-blink. There was sound in her ribs, not breath but a wolf's howl caught under sternum. The gods would elt far as another world. Her fingers tried to remember how to close. She did not feel her legs. Her mouth tried to form names. The sky above the inner ward was a pale wash. Faces hung in it, streaked with the same pallor. She saw Theon first, hair whipped by the fall of air, then Robb, who ran without understanding until he did, and understanding made his steps stumble. "Mother," he said, and knelt, his hands hovering above her, afraid to touch. She tried to answer. A thin string of red ran from the corner of her mouth toward her ear. Bran made a small sound, the noise of a boy wanting to be elsewhere. Servants flowed to the center of the yard. Their voices became a field of wind. Luwin appeared as if conjured by sorrow, and Ser Roderick with his whiskers bristling and his hands shaking. The direwolf's keening came from the kennels, a sound that planted nails in every listener's heart. Somewhere high on the wall, a boy dropped a bucket that burst like a wet clap. Ned arrived with the king. They had started at the Godswood and moved quickly when the cry went up, and then faster, and then like men running from arrows. They came to the broken circle in the crowd and saw the circle's center. Catelyn, Catelyn, Catelyn as if carved wrong by a stonemason, and Bran upon her. Ned said her name like a prayer that could undo itself. Robert froze, all beer and bravado gone from his face, and became a man who knew he'd brought both joy and ruin where he went. Luwin and Roderick lifted Bran, careful as men and clumsy as mourners. Robb tried to help. Ned stopped him with one hand on his shoulder and the other hovering as if he could push death back into place. They bore Bran toward the castle, toward the maester's tower. Ned knelt, taking Catelyn into his arms, what parts of her could be held, and pressed his forehead to hers. "Cat," he said. "Cat." There was breath in her mouth one more time, the faint, fish-silver flicker of it, and then even that was memory. The moment had a shape like a door. After it, the household changed. Every step in Winterfell carried grief like a second body. The queen went to her chambers and sent for a septa. The Golden Knight walked the walls and watched the yard with a face that did not betray the smallest tremor. The children became odd echoes of themselves. Arya, who had always moved like a river, now ran as if she could outrun what had happened. Sansa, whose voice had been a careful flute, now took on the brittle ring of glass. Rickon, too young to know the word forever, knew what it meant without hearing it, clung to Grey Wind's ruff and wept because everyone else did. They buried Catelyn Stark beneath the heart tree. Even those of the chapel sept bent to custom, because grief is older than gods. The weirwood's face watched with eyes red and blind as winter dusk. Ned's voice when he spoke was even and low, and every word found a stone to sit upon. Robb stood tall as if height could be a shield. The boys' direwolves sat like sentries, their eyes golden and wet. Bran was not there. Bran lay very white among clean linens with a bronzewood splint strapped along his back, the air in his chamber taut with herbs and quiet. Luwin had told Ned the truth in the rinsed voice of a man doing his duty. The boy's back would not bear him any longer. There were bruises flowered along his ribs, a frenzy of purple, black, blue, yellow. He woke sometimes and swallowed tears and turned his face toward the ceiling and said nothing. He did not speak of what he had seen. He did not sleep long when he slept. He drifted and caught at dreams as if they were cords, pulling himself up into them to escape the weight of his body. In dreams, he ran. In dreams, his mother always walked beside him and never looked away. On the fourth night after Catelyn's fall, while the royal party still took its suppers and delivered its condolences and treated Winterfell like a theater with a tragic play, firelight threw shapes on Bran's walls. Robb had fallen asleep at the foot of his bed, armor half loosed, a boy pretending to be iron so the world would stop striking. Summer lay like a curved shadow against the bed frame, and gray wind had wedged himself beneath the window, a gray stone with breath. The door was shut. Someone opened it without noise a finger thick. The man who slid through wore leather and a mummer's patience. He smelled faintly of horse and onion. He had been given coin by a careful boy who thought himself a man and had levered a blade from a drunken king's possessions because he wanted to be brave and clever and helpful to his lioness mother. The dagger's hilt was carved from dragon bone and the blade itself had a dark shimmer. It was a thing that loved cutting. The man did not get far. He had a rhythm to his steps. The wolves had their own. Summer's head came up before the man had taken 3 paces. Gray wind flowed to his feet like poured smoke. The assassin lifted a hand without thought, and Summer was already in the air. The blade bit fur and then bit flesh beneath it, scoring Summer's shoulder. Summer's teeth sank into the assassin's wrist. He cried out, a thin, horrified squeal, too high for a killing. Robb's eyes opened to the old part of his mind, the part that woke in storm or alarm, and he was on his feet with a yell. The cutthroat jerked free and lunged for the bed with the blade. Panic burning away plan. The world narrowed to the length of steel, to the warmth of a boy's breath. Gray wind slammed into his legs. The dagger went high, skidding against a rafter, and then the wolves had him. When Robb pulled them off, the man was making small noises through a mouth full of blood. Robb turned him over with disgust and fury tangled like brambles. He saw the dagger and took it up and felt how it moved, how little friction it felt passing through the air. Summer limped to the bed and put his nose against Bran's neck and whined. Robb sent for Luwin and Roderick and for Ned. Ned who came and shirt and knives, his face sharper even than usual. They stood around the ruined man like judges. Robb could not stop looking at the dagger. Luwin, mild and meticulous, touched the assassin's coat and frowned at the coin in his purse. Southern gold and the stamp of the hand stag. Bought by someone who wants to seem something he is not, he said softly. They looked at the blade again. The dragonbone hilt was not unknown. Neither was the rumor traveling on light feet that the small man with mismatched eyes had wagered and won such a piece from another small man with a mockingbird on his pin. Rumors are poor witnesses, Luwin said. Peter Baelish's name slid across Ned's mind as oil slides upon water and did not sink. The face that settled in the oil was Cersei's, and beside it her brother's, as handsome as sin in a prayer book. The boy who would be king played at the center of the picture like a golden pawn. Ned closed his hand about the dagger and found that it made him think, strangely, of snow, clean and pitiless. When morning came, Winterfell still had a queen in it. She stood with composure and red-rimmed eyes in the great hall when Ned demanded their departure. It was the 5th day since Catelyn's body had gone to earth. Robert shifted in his seat and made a noise because he was a hunting hound who wanted to be a king and did not know how to be either at a funeral. Cersei had plans within plans. She drew grief around her like a garment that was both decoration and armor. Lord Stark, she said gently, we would stay, if only to pay proper respects to your lady wife. She glanced across the hall to where Sansa stood, quiet and pale as a lily, and her voice softened because she knew when softness was a blade. Your girls will have need of me in King's Landing. A mother's friend can never be a mother, but still. Ned wondered briefly and fiercely if he could take his daughters and ride for the wall and let the world burn beneath him. Let kings and queens gnaw each other like wolves and never speak again of debt and duty. The thought passed, He had been forged too long ago. "Your Grace," he said to Robert, "allow me this. I will come to King's Landing, and I will serve you as hand, not because I want your court or your Southron weather, because my lady would have told me duty wears a face, and it is yours." His voice did not break on the word. He had learned to keep a steady mouth in wars. Robert seemed relieved, as if he had been waiting for the shape of Ned's decision to appear and had not known what he would do if it did not come. "Good," he said thickly. "Good, Ned." He rose and came down from the dais and put his arms around the friend he had pulled from the Vale School and into a life that cut too deeply. "I am sorry for your loss," he said, and for a moment he sounded like a boy. Then he was king again, bellowing for horses, announcing that the court would move in 2 days. "And God's help me, we'll leave this place before its gods root me in the ground." Ned did not answer. He thought of Catelyn's hands and of the blood that had made a thin red ribbon in her hair. He thought of the dagger in his locked chest, hidden where even masters of whispers would not find it. And he thought of Jaime Lannister's face, the way it came alive when it watched someone fall. He did not speak to the queen again before they left. She visited the sept and left a lily, white as milk, at the base of a stranger's altar because that was the language she knew. Then she met her brother on the wall and they spoke in murmurs, the words blown thin by wind. Neither looked down. Winterfell's courtyard was a churn of hoof and leather and the bright noise of leaving. Sansa clung to her father's cloak and would not be drawn from sobbing until he told her she would come south and be presented at court and remembered for her beauty. Arya watched from the steps, small and coiled, the hilt of a wooden practice sword peeping from beneath her tunic. Jon stood by the armory door, hands in fists, trying not to notice the heaviness in his limbs when he saw his father and knew he would not be going with him. He wished, rather stupidly, that Catelyn had not died, because then he might have had something like a mother to be gentle with or to rage against, instead of the nothing that pricked him from within. He felt like a map without a key. "You'll go to the wall," Ned told him a night before when the fires were low. "Benjen will see you placed. I'll ask Mormont to look at you. You have the stuff in you for it, Jon." Jon had nodded because boys nod when they are told what they already know. Robb did not choose. He stood in armor that did not yet sit right upon him and accepted the weight of Winterfell as if it were a sword that would someday fit his hand exactly. He parted from his father and did not cry because his mother lay beneath a tree that did not shed tears and because the eyes of his men warmed or cooled with every breath he took. He bent to Bran, kissed his brow, murmured something that only Bran heard. Bran blinked and stared at his brother's turning shoulders and felt the first ember of a hurt he would carry into days that did not exist yet. King, queen, children, courtiers, dogs, cooks, whores, squires, and hangers-on left Winterfell with the taste of grief on their tongues and the smell of cold in their lungs. The north closed around itself after like a wound. The wolves returned to their courses, hunting the thin-hipped deer that left silent tracks in the margins of snow. Robb learned quickly where the stones of the keep caught at your feet and where a word would fail to turn a lord who needed turning. He learned the names of men he had only seen at feasts and how they drank, and how they fought, and what anger underlay the way they spoke. The letter table in the solar filled with tidings written by ink-stiff hands from Hornwood and Serwyn and Manderley. The men from White Harbor sent word of ships. Out of the narrow sea fat with lace and tin, the men from Barrow Tun sent a complaint about taxes. The Umbers sent a boar's head with a declaration of undying fealty scrawled across its cheeks. With Catelyn gone, the household's gravity shifted. Where she had been, there was a hollow to be filled by discipline or by accident. Robb took long walks and did not sleep as he should and looked older each week, not taller but honed. Tyrion Lannister came through Winterfell again on his way south from the Wall, thawing on the road with a Lannister Martin's wryness. He had given Bran a gift before he left in King Robert's party, a set of plans for a saddle that would let a boy whose legs had gone quiet sit a horse without falling. Robb had accepted it with a stiffness that was not quite suspicion and not quite gratitude. He had learned already that the world did not arrange itself in clean lines. When Tyrion returned, he asked to see the boy and brought a tinker at his heel who could interpret plans into leather and iron. Bran took the first ride, not with joy, joy came after, when his body remembered that wind could lift a face, but with caution. The dire wolves ran beside him, their tongues a ribbon of red against tooth white. He did not smile until they circled the yard. When he did, it broke rules in Robb's chest. Tyrion watched, hands tucked in his fur collar, and took the measure of the Stark boy who would be a lord, and of the other boy who might have been the least of them and now seemed the beginning of something else. The air around Winterfell was colder than the Vale's high passes. It thrilled his lungs. The Stark dead had been put under their stones, but grief streamed in the halls as if winter had found a way through even here. "You have my thanks," Robb told him in measured tones. Tyrion smiled and did not say that thanks from a Stark was the kind of coin that could not be minted in Lannisport. The road to King's Landing was long enough that sorrow could take on shapes and be carried, fastened, dropped, picked back up. Sansa arranged hers in neat bracelets of lamentation and wore them with careful posture. Arya gave hers a blade and practiced with it when no one looked. Ned bound his with rope and kept it in his chest with the letters he wrote by candlelight to Robb, to Luwin, to Maester Cole at the Dreadfort, to a woman he did not name in the letters because paper had too many eyes. King's Landing rose like glass in a tangle of stone and sea. Heat greeted them like a hastily remembered kiss. The smell of it struck them first, the rot and bloom of it, the way it extracted sweat from foreheads and secrets from mouths. The Red Keep was a palace that hid knives in its tapestries. Ned did not like it the moment he saw it and liked it less with every rung he climbed. Robert, who had been a boy with him in the Vale, found rabble and roared. He slapped Ned on the back and swore that they would drink through sadness the way men drank through drought. Cersei's eyes weighed every gesture. Joffrey's hand stayed near his sword hilt more often than not. He enjoyed the feel of being near something that could make others bleed. Sansa saw him and put a lily bud where her heart had been, and it reopened in kisses he did not offer. Duty returned the dagger to Ned's thoughts. The city had its own whispering network. Every stone had heard a dozen names. He met Lord Peter Baelish in a court so crowded with light it looked like a trap, and Peter smiled at him like a boy watching a cat stalk a bird. He said that time had dimmed none of Ned's virtues or his charm. He said that the Queen and her brother were often together because family was solace in a cold court. He said many things without saying the one that mattered. He knew, and he would sell what he knew to the highest bidder or to the bidder he fancied. Ned did not speak of towers. He went instead to see a girl with black hair at a smith's. The heat was a dragon that panted. The boy who worked there had the heavy jaw of a Baratheon and the startled, shy gaze of a child who had grown tall overnight. Tobo Mott, fat and sleek as a cat, hummed with minding that Ned should not be there. Ned made a shape of things in his head. Black hair and then more black hair, here and in the streets, and at a brothel in a low district where milk soured in the heat and a woman nurse-fed a child with hands too large for a cradle. Seed is strong, someone had found written in a book, but Ned did not need ink to tell him what sinew he saw in faces. He did not forget the way Jaime Lannister's hair had gleamed by a window. You could walk King's Landing a while and never catch the same smell twice. You could sit by your daughter while she learned a courtly bow and think about how a dagger would slide along a throat. You could go to the small council and find men who seemed like hands with rings for minds. Varys drifted in silk like a wisp of old smoke. Renly brought smiles, too polished to be entirely warm. Pycelle wheezed wisdom like old bellows. Baelish stacked coin and secrets. Cersei drew her family tight and insisted it was duty that did it. Jaime answered to no counsel but his own, which was the color of his sister's hair. When the boar speared Robert, the crown began to wobble on a head that had never worn it lightly. Some gods were watching that day, some laughed. The king lay with an open belly debating the taste of wine. He signed his will and had it changed by stout words and a meaning that would, in Pycelle's whisper, be no part of law when the ink dried. Ned wrote to Stannis and sent the letter by a man he trusted less than he trusted his milk. He sat with his daughters and watched Sansa's eyelids quiver when he spoke of returning them to Winterfell. "He is my love," she said of Joffrey, as if love were a spell that could prevent beheadings or teach a boy mercy. Arya stared at the floor and then at her father's hand upon the table and then at the thin line. of dust gathering under the windowsill that no one else noticed. She took instruction from Sirio Farrell, who did not raise his voice, and learned how to be light. Robert died. The city caught its breath, and the queen let it out with her grip. Ned went to the throne room with paper in his hand and a hope that looked, even to him, like an old man's staff. Joffrey sat there because a mother had put him there. The city watch stood between them and the truth like a river men had to cross. Ned looked at Littlefinger and saw a man who would not hold a rope if it meant making a bridge. He looked at the spears and saw that Coin bent knees. He told them what the law required. It did not matter. They bent their spears when Littlefinger smiled and told him he had warned him not to trust him. Jaime was not there to draw a sword. Tyrion was and was not. He slipped into the Red Keep's quiet architecture and took in the sound of steel and of broken honor as if it were a play staged for his entertainment and his dread. He was not large enough to change it. He would later be asked to. He watched as the City Watch took Eddard Stark, and he thought, Catelyn Stark died in the north because my brother cannot keep from being my sister's lover. He thought, the world is a wheel and sometimes it grinds the wrong people into flour. Sansa knelt at Cersei's feet and begged with a voice that had learned how to be soft and bright as practice required. The queen petted her hair and turned her face toward the window where the bay threw light up against the walls. Arya slipped from rooms, through kitchens, into alleyways where meat juice ran black and flies swarmed. And she did not stop moving until the Red Keep fell behind and everything was different. Ned sat in a cell and thought of the Godswood's red sap. He thought of Catelyn's last breath, of Bran's silent stare, of Robb's new shoulders. He thought that twice in his life he had chosen honor and twice it had called death to his door. He was not wrong, only unlucky. The North heard. The ravens seemed to know where to bear the heaviest messages. Robb broke the seal with a boy's motion and a man's steadiness and read until the words stopped giving sense. He put the paper down and did not speak and then found he was speaking, calling men to him, calling banners, calling fealty to his father and to the line under Winterfell that had been cut and must be mended. Great John Umber bellowed in the hall loud enough to shake dust from beams, declared Ned Stark a man wronged, and spoke of vengeance without eloquence. His was a speech of meat and bone. Bolton smiled a knife smile and did sums in his head. Karstark crushed a cup in his grip and did not blink. The Riverlords would not sit long with a Tully father ill and a Lannister host stirring. For Tywin Lannister had felt the North's breath on his table and had begun to cut maps the way men cut meat. To reach the Riverlands, Robb needed the twins. To win them, he needed an old man's permission. The choice came like a doorway with two exits, one where he broke himself on Walder Frey's stone stubbornness, another where he broke his word. He buckled his sword and went. He took with him the Great John, the silent grimness of Roose Bolton, a sheaf of letters, a cache of hope. At the twins, he found Walder Frey full of thin old spite and thin old wine, squinting from a chair like a spider from his web. Robb stood before him, too young to be entirely inscrutable but managing something like it. He spoke respectfully. He did not bend more than he had to. That, more than any eloquence, warmed Walder's withered pride. The terms he set were iron nails, safe passage for vows, a marriage promise to one of his brood, hostages exchanged, a fostering to bind promise to stone. Robb accepted because his father's head had been set upon a spike in his mind, even if not yet in the capital, because his mother lay under a tree and could not speak to him about courage and caution, because the Great John stood ready to take the twins by storm if he failed, and that would be a thing that would cost them more than coin. He thought of honor not as a tower but as a road. He signed the paper and drank the Frey's thin wine and did not spit. At the Whispering Wood, Robb showed the South how the North hunted. Catelyn had once said a boy who knows how a wolf kills may someday know how to rule wolves. In the press of trees, where the river hissed like someone shushing secrets, Robb split his men and drove hard for Jaime's camp. Scouts died without a sound. Torches went out. Hooves whispered in mud. When Jaime mounted and rode, thinking himself out and clear, he found himself funneled. Grey Wind went for the gilt horse and took a piece of it and left the rest to scream. Knights trained to fight under banners floundered under branches. Jaime fought like water. Nothing in him stopped moving. but he was a sword without a shield, and all the shields around him had wolves painted upon them. They caught him because Robb had learned where to be and when to leave and how to come back with teeth bared. When Jaime stood before the young lord that night, he looked at Robb as if appraising a sword's steel and found fewer flaws than he had expected. "You have your father's eyes," he said, and said nothing else that mattered. Robb ordered chain, ordered bread, ordered watchfulness. In his dreams that night, he went to the Godswood Mulesoft and cried where none of his men could see. In King's Landing, Tyrion Lannister became a hinge. Tywin was a man who knew where doors were and how to use a key. He told his least loved son where to stand to keep the door half open and half shut. Tyrion did what he did best: asserted himself in rooms that did not want him, spoke to men who thought they were the only clever ones, drank carefully, watched constantly. He saw Sansa in the yard with her hands folded like white fish. He saw Joffrey with his lip curled and his fingers drumming impatient. Tilly on an arm of wood. He saw Cersei moving people on the board and Jaime missing from her side and thus her temper sharper. He went to Varys and listened to silk rustle. He went to Pycelle and listened to breath wheeze. He tested the walls of power and found that only some sections would bear weight. When it came time to set a blade to Eddard Stark's neck, he argued and cajoled and sought to delay. Joffrey loved the theater of it too much to stop. The boy king announced the sentence and made a small sound that echoed a line he had heard in a song about what it meant to rule. A king must rule. The sword took the head. The crowd gasped and spilled fear like gout of wine. Sansa folded inward until her body learned a new shape for grief. Arya did not see because the city had hidden her, because Syrio had used up his gentle in the only great fight he would get, and because Yoren had taken her arm and said words that made her name into something malleable. The North howled. Vengeance is a language older than laws. They crowned Robb king in the North in a hall that smelled of wood smoke and blood. Great John raised his sword until it kissed the rafters. Men pounded table planks with fists until their knuckles bled or their cups cracked. Robb knelt once under the weight of the crown and felt what a metal ring could mean when it was made into the shape of a thing you could not set down. The crown belonged on his head by axe, not by birth. He stood and said he would break the Lannisters and take his sisters home. His voice did not crack. He had learned by then how to bind his voice. Walder Frey sent daughters north to Winterfell and sons south to Robb. The Frey girl chosen for Robb was named Roslyn in one version of the future, but in this one Walder set in front of Robb a different child. A careful, plain-faced girl with eyes that looked at you like she had a hunger for facts. Robb looked at her and thought of duty. He married her because he had sworn. The Riverlords nodded, some with relief that they would not be asked to hand their daughters to a boy with a war crown, some with contempt for his early yoke. He lay with his wife and was kind to her, which is a sort of love when you are very young, and found that she listened more than she spoke, and that had value. The war breathed in and out. Tywin Lannister moved his pieces with a cold hand. Stannis raised his banner on Dragonstone with the weight of law and the warmth of a hearth's ash. Justice that did not glow enough to gather men in winter. Renly pitched his bright tents and fed men meat until their bellies were his. Tyrion, set finally in the hand's seat by a father who could not bring himself to sit in eyeshot of a daughter undistracted by a favorite son, turned the city's hunger into a weapon and counted coins and found them wanting. He began to shift words around as if they were stones in a dike. He sent Myrcella away to Dorne because he could sacrifice a piece if it bought him time. He put Janos Slynt in a place where he could be watched. He tried to push Joffrey's temper into corners where it would do less harm. He tried to be a Lannister in a way that did not rot the air. He failed sometimes. Cersei watched him and waited. In the north, word of iron came from the sea. Theon, who had been held like a pawn for so long that he had learned to model himself on pieces that moved in straight lines, asked to be sent. He pictured himself as something more than captor or captive. Robb measured him with eyes that had learned to take in the shape of usefulness. He sent him into the stomach of his father's house to turn an old prisoner into a new ally. It had the shape of audacity.
Theon Rode.
He wore a grin he thought looked like intent. He found his father an older version of the god he worshipped, bleak and barnacled and unbending. He found his sister a better version of himself. He found that the sea kept no promises but its own. Strategists in the Dreadhold at Pike had no need of the North's friendship. They preferred its wounds. The sails rose, black as pillow talk, and went sifting along the coast where the North was soft. Winterfell learned to burn without Catelyn there to see it. The gray of ash looked out of place against the stubborn brown stones. Theon took it because he could not take anything larger, held it with men who bled loyalty for coin, and lost it to men who bled for something else or nothing at all. Bran left because his dreams told him to and because Hodder's back was broad and steady. Mira and Jojen arrived like the answer to a riddle Bran didn't know he had asked. Their green dreams slotted into his wolf dreams until what he saw behind his eyes stitched a map the way a spider makes a web. Osha led and the wolves went with her. They threaded the world northward, away from a home that had become a ruin of gray, away from a boy who had strangled what little honor he had left to give himself the shape of a man. Rickon cried and would not stop crying until he learned, as children do, that tears ease without solving. He learned to make a game of hiding and to make a meal of roots. When news of the raising of Winterfell reached Robb, he stood for long minutes with his face like a mask and his fist in the map's rivers, leaving a smear of blood that dried to a dark line. His wife came to him and set her hand to his forearm and said nothing because nothing she could say would not feel smaller than the thing. He turned to her and put his forehead to hers and thought of wolves, and of boys, and of a woman under a red tree. He planned a march home and then planned another south. Duty had become a chain that ran through him in two directions. It would take him years to cut one link. He sent men north to find what could be found, to bury what could be buried. He kept riding south because kings cannot choose only one wrong and make it right while leaving the others on the table. Jaime sat in a cell and talked to shadows that had name. Honor, oath, love. He smiled at Robb when the young king came to measure him, and the smile was complicated and contained something like admiration. "What would you have me say?" he asked. "That I pushed your brother? That I meant to, what? Save something? Destroy something else?" His face closed. He had learned that words could be used as weapons or as keys. Sometimes they were just the echo of a door closing. Robb left him there because a man like that was poison and medicine at the same time. Sansa learned the shape of a cage from the inside. She learned how to curtsy so low that no one would see her eyes. She learned the faces of the men who watched her, which ones would look away if she cried, which ones would smile, which ones would turn because her hands were small and they remembered their sisters. She found a friend in a strange place, in a small man who spoke to her as if she were a person even when he needed her to be a piece. Tyrion married her because it was a move on a board his sister made. He treated her with gentleness because gentleness is sometimes the only rebellion left to men who see how much of the game is ugliness. She did not love him. She did not hate him either. She reserved that for the boy who thought himself a dragon's heir and was only a cruel child with a crown. She learned to watch the sky for birds that carried messages. She learned to wait with her jaw clenched. Arya turned into water and moved between rocks. Wolves and boys and wattled wives and half-starved soldiers were things she learned to be around without smelling like prey. She tucked names into corners of her mouth and said them when she was cold. At night she looked up and pictured the red leaves of the godswood as hands waiting for her to put her face in them and be blessed with a touch she could call mother. She would not see Winterfell's walls again for some time. The world kept bending. By the time snow began to whisper into men's beards in camps and on the road and in towns where bread had new prices, the lines had set. The north and riverlands under Robb held the middle of the land like someone holding their ribs after a blow. The Lannisters held a throne and a city that ate its own. Stannis gathered law around himself and kept it like a fire that warmed no tent but his own. Renly made feasts grander than his army's discipline. The Ironborn chewed the North's coasts and spat splinters into the sea. Jon Snow at the wall listened to wind, felt full of teeth. We become different people when we lose the hand that steadied us. Catelyn Stark's absence did not make bones grow back that had split. It did not take swords from boys' hands or political appetite from women who had learned how to feed on it. It made Winterfell a house that learned how to stand even when one of its pillars had been kicked out by a fair-haired man who thought himself necessary to love. It made Ned Stark a ghost more quickly and more piteously than he might have been, and then a banner in boys' minds. It made Robb a king sooner, and with that crown came only more versions of loss. It made Sansa more careful with words and with not speaking. It made Arya leaner. It made Bran a boy who learned the names of trees and birds and the feel of a wolf's gait in his blood and the dangerous comfort of seeing things that other people could not. It made Tyrion more certain that he could build a raft out of a family that would prefer to drown him. It made Cersei draw tighter the bowstring of every plan. It made Jaime dwell longer upon windows. In a tent by a river with a name that had soaked in blood, Robb Stark stood at a table and put aside the vision that rose unasked whenever he closed his eyes. His father on steps with sword taken from him. His mother's hair fanned like a dark river over unforgiving stone. And discussed fodder and siege lines with men who had been masters of their houses before he could properly shave. Great John wanted to split Tywin. Bolton preferred to make the Lannister bleed out slow. Rickard Karstark whispered for vengeance for his sons and found no purchase for his blade. The crown dug a little deeper with each word. Robb listened until listening became the only thing that kept him from being carried away by rage. At last he said, "We will hold the fords and make them pay dear for every inch." His wife stood in the tent's doorway and looked at him with a face that could hold tenderness and terror at once. That look had been Catelyn's gift, too, how to love beyond herself and yet note where men stepped foolishly. He wished, fiercely, that he could ask her for counsel. On a night when the wind came down from the hills and shook the canvas, when somewhere a harp sang in a camp of men who were at least briefly only singers, Robb walked alone outside the circle of tents. Gray wind shadowed him. He looked up. The stars in the north were so sharp they seemed to carve the dark. He could smell snow coming the way a hunter smells a change in deer. He thought of his mother as she had been, quiet and warm, laughing when one of the children fell in the snow and came up with cheeks bright as apples. He did not know he was smiling until his mouth ached from not having done it in so long. He dropped to a knee and put his forehead to the crown of Grey Wind's head and let himself cry because there was no one to see but a wolf and the cold. In the city to the south where winter looked like a rumor, a small man sat on a balcony and drank wine that tasted vaguely of apples and thought of a tower. He thought of what a man had done there for love. He thought of what a woman had done there for love. He did not judge their loves equally. He could see how love made fools of men. He did not think it should make monsters of them, but he knew that it could, and often did. Bran in a ruined tower held to a dream that had the shape of truth. The weirwood's face that he saw in sleep had Catelyn's eyes for an instant and then Biel. Ed read and spoke a name he did not know. He learned to slide his mind into summer's warm shape and run, and that was a joy that made it hard to come back to the cold bed and the ache in his back and the bruise of memory. He remembered the fall. He remembered hands, one pair calloused, one pair with no callus at all. He remembered a voice that had sounded almost kind. He held those images carefully in his chest the way people hold embers. He did not tell anyone yet because he thought this knowledge was a sort of sword. It needed heat and time before he could draw it. Not even kings could stop winter. Crept like mold. It made candles spill faster and made breath a visible thing. It made steel sing oddly under a hammer. Letters arrived less often because ravens needed fat and men with hands that did not shake. When the snows began to find their way into the south, there were men in golden armor who did not own cloaks in proper colors, and they shivered. When it whirled against the wall, there were men in black who counted watchfires and counted brothers and found they could count all of both too easily. Somewhere in between, a king had to choose between making a winter less bad for his people and making war more profitable for his cause. Robb did the former as often as he could get away with, and the latter when pushed because kings do not get to be saints and win. The Red Wedding never happened because vows had been made and kept, but weddings were not spells. They were contracts, thin armor against knives and men's appetites. Walder Frey smiled like a slit in cloth and sent sheep at fair prices and waited for the day when he could make better use of a debt. It would come. He was patient in a way that outlasted many things, even hunger. There are worlds with less blood in them. There is only one Westeros that belongs to these men and women and wolves. In this one, Catelyn Stark fell and did not get back up, and so the North learned to stand without her, though its spine ached in winter. Ned fell too and told the world with his death that honor is not armor. Robb rose too quickly and tried to grow into a shape that left him little room to breathe. Sansa learned lies by sitting within them. Arya learned truths by stripping them off until she was bare. Tyrion found that he could hold a city together with poor glue and be hated for being there when it cracked anyway. Jaime learned that the window he pushed others from also framed a view he would have to watch for a very long time. Cersei learned nothing and kept moving as if she were a river. Bran learned that a boy can be a wolf and a boy and something else, something that does not have a word in the Southron tongue. If you had asked anyone in a tavern which of these moves the world and which are moved, you would have gotten as many answers as cups. What happened was this. In the wake of a fall, love did what it always does. It broke and bound in equal measure. The stones of Winterfell, having taken what they took, held what they could still. The North remembered, and in the remembering there was a quiet fury that would outlast many kings. The river made a slow, stubborn sound under the castle's red stone, as if it had learned the pace of men who held bridges under siege. Robb stood over the map and listened to that sound as though it were counsel. The candles had burned down to cups of fat and string, and every line of ink had been traced and retraced by his finger until he knew their lengths like scars. The great John sprawled in a chair as if it were a log he had felled himself. His laugh had slowed over the past months but not dimmed. Roose Bolton held himself at the edge of light, where his pallor looked like a cloak. Rickard Karstark did not sit. He paced because his grief would not stay in a chair. "They're bleeding us," the great John rumbled, tapping two sausage-thick fingers on the ford. "Tywin's a butcher. He'll slice and never let the roast hit the spit. He'll be forced to commit if we starve him of the countryside he intends to feed on," Bolton said. "Fire is a persuasion, punishment for Lannister friends and Lannister fear. You would burn farms that fed the Trident since the Conqueror," Karstark snapped without looking at him, and that made the Dreadlord's mouth do a little flicker that a kinderman's mouth would have made into a grimace. Bolton's face stayed a mask. "We starve or we bite," the great John said. "I was born to bite." "We do both," Robb said. He felt the crown when he spoke, not the bronze rings on his brow, but the way the air shifted when he decided and voices leaned toward or away from the words. "We send riders to take what can be taken, burn only what will feed our enemy this season, not what will feed children next year. We hold the fords and make him strike where we choose." "And what of Jaime Lannister?" Karstark's eyes were coals. There was no question in them, only accusation. "He remains our hostage." Robb kept his voice even. He had learned that evenness shaved a keen edge. "A hostage for whom?" Karstark said. "I had 2 sons. Both were men before the Kingslayer made them meet. The Queen keeps your sisters like birds in a cage. If you believe she will trade her brother for a songbird, you are still a boy." The words landed. Grey Wind, lying by the map table with his chin on his paws, lifted his head and showed his teeth. Robb set a hand on the wolf's skull and felt the thrum there, the thread tying his temper to Grey Winds. "We keep Jaime because he is worth keeping," Robb said. "Not because I am a boy and not because my sister's songs will charm a queen. There may come a day when he buys food for a winter village or walls for a river holdfast or safe passage for men I've never met. Today is not that day." Karstark's breath rasped. "My sons will not eat that food. They will not walk those walls." "No," Robb said, "but the children under them will." Karstark left with a small bow that was not courtesy and not surrender. When the tent flap fell, the great John pushed out a noise. "He'll try to kill the Kingslayer himself if we don't watch him," he said, not disapproving, only predicting. "I know," Robb said. Bolton said nothing. His eyes were still, and Robb, who was learning to take the measure of silence, did not trust the stillness. A rider came on the second candle. He had dust where eyebrows should be and spoke fast for a Northman. "From White Harbor, my king. Letters you'd meant for a fortnight past. The seas were a wolf's back. Robb broke the seal with the careful economy of a man who opened more messages than he slept hours. Manderley sent ships. Manderley sent coin. Manderley sent a daughter to court who would be pleased to wear blue in a place that ate blue and red and gold and bone. Robb set that aside with a faint relaxation of the shoulders. He had learned to store such sips of good water in a dry season. In King's Landing, the season was all heat. Tyrion kept a list on a scraped slate in the Tower of the Hand. He did not trust lists made only in the mind. Men were too prone to adjust the contents of their heads to suit their hopes. He chalked out wildfire, chain, ships, the hound, the boy, the bells, the gate. He rubbed at his scar with a knuckle. It had not yet become a story. It was a line of pain that talked louder on damp days. He took the pick-slick steps down to the Guildhall, and the smell hit him like a warm slap. Sour wine, piss, old varnish, something sweet that pretended not to be decay. "Ser Haleen," he said to the pale alchemist, whose eyebrows were as delicate as a maiden's stitches. "Tell me again how many jars will not explode if a man sighs on them." Haleen beamed and said something that usefully ignored the word, again. Tyrion counted anyway and decided how many men he could stand to lose by accident and not lose the city. Sansa wore grief like a veil that never showed soil. She stood in the sept with fingers laced, and the light from the high windows made a lace of its own across her knuckles. Septa Mordain had taught her how to pray as if someone were listening. She prayed that way now, not because she believed that a face carved in wood or copper would bend, but because she had learned that a steady mouth in a storm can still feel like a lantern. When she finished, she found Tyrion in the shadows of the vestibule. "My lady," he said, and bowed the exact right amount, the amount that said, "You are my wife and also a child." He had not asked for this marriage, but he had not resisted it with anything like the force he saved for other battles. The realm had put Sansa in his hands like a sick bird. One does not crush a sick bird because you cannot cure it. He offered his arm. She took it because she must. They walked a corridor where the air was less holy and more honest. The city made its ugly noises in the distance. "I have sent a message to your brother," he said, and felt her arm stiffen. He did not keep his voice low for spies. He assumed they were everywhere. Whispering only gave them the pleasure of being right. A letter for a letter, honor for honor. Nothing binding. Something better than nothing. "What did you tell him?" Her voice was dry, but she was speaking. "That was something. That I cannot free you," he said. He did not varnish. "But that I can keep the Boy King's claws off you as long as I breathe, and as long as I can make him afraid of the city he sits in." He felt her flinch at Boy King and did not apologize. "That I will never ask you for love. That I will never touch you unless the world itself demands it. And even then I'll argue with the world." She looked at him then, not because he was a Lannister or a hand or a husband, but because he was a man who had offered her a piece of truth, however small, with clean hands. "Thank you, my lord," she said. The words sounded like an arranged marriage in their niceness, but something beneath them moved. It was not fondness. It was not yet trust. It was the recognition that a wall is better than a rope. When the bells rang for battle, they shook dust from the rafters and birds from the rafters sleep. Joffrey loved bells when they were for him, when they meant the city would be tested. He puckered and turned to his mother and licked fear off his lip as if it were honey. The hound smelled wildfire already and frowned, a hard line that looked like the print of a knife. Tyrion went to the wall and felt the city under his boots the way a sailor feels a deck that intends to buckle but has not yet learned how. Smoke lay like a cat. Stannis' ships came in a procession that made the Blackwater look like a field of rotten stubble sprouting black stalks. When they lit the river, the sky learned a new color. Men who had seen siege fires strung along walls widened their eyes as if the world had invented a fresh hell just to spite them. Green went up like a shouted insult and fell like a curtain and crawled like an animal that wanted to live. Tyrion watched the chain pull tight across the mouth of the harbor and thought, "You can trust iron. Pyromancers are craftsmen you cannot entirely trust. Iron is honest. Men died. They screamed, so they were still men. Joffrey was pulled from the wall like a child from an argument it might lose. The Hound left in a blaze of his own temper. Tyrion led the sortie because someone had to, and because he had learned that telling men to die while you stood behind them made your voice thinner. He made it through the first gate and the second. At the third, he took a sword to the face and woke later to find the city one and his father in the hall and the girl queen of the Reach smiling where his daughter queen had planned to sit. He tasted iron more than wine for days. He asked after Sansa. She had left the sept unmolested, but Cersei's eye was bright upon her. He slept in a bed no one chose for him and woke to the news that he had been thanked by being removed. The Tyrells were flowers planted in stone. They brought fat sheep and full trains and song. They brought Marjorie's smile, which convinced people to want things they had not known were desirable. They brought Loras, who wore grief as a private shirt and glory as a cloak again. Littlefinger wore them all like jewels and took every credit that stuck. That was his skill and his poison both. Robb felt the shape of that battle in rumors that shed truth like water from fat. It did not change his plans. It changed some men's voices when they approached the table and changed the size of their requests. His Fry wife looked at him when they were alone and said, "How long can you keep this up?" Her voice was quiet. It was not the voice of a girl who wished to stop war so she could go home. It was the voice of someone who had seen dogs fight to the death and wondered when men would learn to untie themselves. He wanted to touch her cheek. He wanted to say his mother would have asked the question differently, and he missed that different more than he missed sleep. He said only, "As long as I must." Karstark's rage took him in the night, in the old market hall of a village that had changed hands 3 times since Frost. The Lannister boys had not seen a northern winter. They had seen prison straw and the shape of the ceiling above their pallet. The guards were drunk with a cheap, mean wine and grief and cold. Karstark did not bring many men. He did not need many. When he left, the floor was blacker than it had been when they entered. They caught him before dawn. He did not resist capture. He did not plead. He stood under a sky the color of pewter and said, "You should have let me do it under a roof. It will snow." Robb looked at him for a long time because he knew that every man in the yard, including the executioner, would watch the watching. A king can no more cut off a head because he is angry than he can spare one because he is sad, he said. "You killed children to avenge men. You made your grief into a banner and marched under it. I cannot follow you there." Karstark knelt. He did not ask for mercy. The sword did what it was made to do. Snow began to tick on ears and shoulders as if it had been waiting for a cue. Robb watched the men from Carhold ride out and felt how that many hoofbeats tear something that had been woven together by oaths and dinners and hard rides, and the way men's hands fall into closeness when they sleep in a line. The Great John spat into the new snow. Bolton asked, very quietly, if the captains should be doubled on guard. Robb nodded because a man who lost a branch should watch the trunk. Jaime Lannister learned the pace of a cell by walking it 12 steps one way, 12 back, until his feet could have counted for him. He tried to count his blessings and found none that did not have a knife edge. The Northmen fed him, worked seesaws on his chains with something like care, and did not trade their hatred for conversation. He constructed an army of words to talk to. Some nights he built towers of story upon story and found himself a hero in each. Some nights he remembered what Catelyn Stark's eyes had looked like right before they closed, and his stories went away like light when you cupped the candle. It was Roose Bolton who came to him, pale and precise, with a smile stripped of mirth. "You are expensive," Bolton said softly. "A man could buy bread for a year, or a castle's mortar for a season, with what you are worth." "Oh, do," Jaime said. "Use me as mortar. I've always longed to be in the foundations of something cold." Bolton watched him the way a cat watches a bird that is in no danger from anyone but time. "When men like me speak to men like you," he said, "they assume one thing, that our purposes are single. I assume something else. My purposes breed." He left. Jaime listened to the small scrape and slide of bolts and thought, there is a man who keeps his knives where others keep their knives, but also where they keep their spoons. When the message came that Tywin required the Kingslayer's return or would set the Riverlands on fire from every gate and keep them alight until women boiled their children for sorrow, Robb took the paper, folded it twice, and said to the messenger, Tell Lord Tywin the Riverlands are already on fire. If he wishes to claim credit for the weather, he must write a letter to the sky. Tyrion wrote again to Robb, this time more carefully. He did not propose explicit exchange. He sketched boundaries between the lines, as if a boy might be allowed to see his sister's face in a sept with one guard and a priest, as if a parcel of riverfolk might be allowed to walk unmolested from a town burnt by one banner to a town held by another. Sometimes you could only nudge the world into being less ugly. He could almost hear Catelyn Stark's voice telling him that sometimes was not enough. He kept writing anyway. Arya wore a cap that made her look like a shorter boy from a family that had 3 other boys and had run out of names. She learned the feel of Harrenhal's stones under her sawls, how they held heat that hurt your feet and then turned it into a cold that hurt the bones. She learned that work could make you invisible, and invisibility could be a blade. Jaqen Hagar called her pretty names and then taught her the shapes of 3 deaths as if they were letters in a new alphabet. She asked for the right ones each time. She felt their ends like a bell she had never rung but had heard in dreams. When she slipped away with Gendry and hot pie under a moon that had put a veil over itself, she tasted something strange in her mouth. Turned out to be hope. They walked through woods that had learned to hold sound and let it go without ever letting it wander far. They ate bread that tasted more like memory than grain. The Brotherhood without banners took them the way sunlight takes dust. Gently at first, then completely. Beric had a face like a ruin and a voice like a prayer. Thuras drank and talked to his god in the same tone. They tried to teach Arya that justice and vengeance were cousins who could be coaxed to a table without knives. She nodded and listened and sharpened needle whenever no one watched. They brought her to a place where the river spoke in low syllables and the wind played a harp. There were banners that did not belong to any house she had learned to fret over. There were men who said her brother's name with teeth bared in a way that could be a smile and could be a threat to someone else. She heard talk of Freys and wolves as if they were less kin to each other than hunger to blade. No red wedding. Not yet. Rosalind, married to a man with a crown, had not turned knives into forks. She tucked that away and prayed to no god for a reunion with a mother already beneath a tree. She had learned that some prayers were simply ways to stop yourself from screaming. Beyond the wall, the air tasted of iron and pine and something else. Something that made Jon's skin tighten as if a cold hand had stroked the hairs there. Qhorin Halfhand used words like he used his short sword. Each cost something. We need a man among them, he said to Jon as if they spoke about repairing a roof. We need the boy nobody notices until the day they do. Jon nodded. He had long practice at being looked at with love and not with belonging. He let Ygritte live because it felt like defying the world more than obeying it. She laughed when he did because she understood a kind of defiance that asked men to climb things they had no right climbing. His first night in Mance's camp felt like a song he didn't know the words to but could hum. Fires crooked the horizon. Men and women lay or sat in heaps that were more families than armies. The smell was like every tannery and field meal and dog run he had known collapsed into one. Ygritte told him stories as if she were buying his soul and overpaying. He did not tell her many of his. There were some coins you did not put on the table unless the pot promised you something more than being alive the next morning. When she told him, "You know nothing, Jon Snow," she made it sound like a holy title and a curse both. When they climbed the wall, there was a moment when the ice thought it might have them, and then a moment when the wind decided not to take him, and then Ygritte laughed with the sky in her mouth. He laughed because he did not know what else to do with the terror that had no name. Bran's dreams knit the dark together. He saw the world from low to the ground, from high in branches, from the curl of a wolf's lip. He saw the weirwood's face with red tears frozen mid-fall and thought sometimes the face looked like his mother's if she had been carved as a god. Mira hummed softly when she mended, and the sound made the cold feel less like a message and more like a field they would cross eventually. Jojen spoke less as winter deepened. When he spoke, it was to say, "Close your eyes, open them again. What changes? That is the thing you need." Hodder carried not only Bran's body but the piece of Bran that had not yet learned to be two things at once. In the ruins of a watch that had once watched men and now watched only birds, they shared bread with Samwell Tarly, whose breath smoked in sorrow, and whose hands shook with the knowledge that sometimes the fat boy in the song killed the monster. The black gate opened to words and water. Bran felt the cold under the ground like a river. When it closed, something sealed in him, too. A thing that had been half fear and half homesickness, now turned into a direction. Theon Greyjoy forgot his name in pieces. Ramsay Snow stole it one letter at a time and put each letter in his pocket as if they were coins. Theon learned to flinch before the flinch was required. He learned that kindness could be wielded like a lash. He learned that remorse is a hunger that never gets full. Winterfell burned whether he watched or not. He smelled it in dreams for years. If you had told him then that the North would someday welcome him with a forgiveness that was not blessing but balm, he would not have believed you. He did not yet know how to do any kind of math that would allow that sum. Stannis Baratheon's letters moved like little knives in the air. One reached Robb by way of a knight who had once eaten at Storm's End and now ate in tents. The parchment said, in effect, "Bend, because the law is not a thing to be shaped by grief or frost." It was signed in a hand that looked like a man clinging to the side of a cliff. Robb read it twice and set it aside for an hour because immediate anger is almost always less useful than the kind that can be ridden a long distance. He answered thus, "The North remembers. The North protects itself. The North is not a rumor Stannis can make real by writing it in his decree." He sent the letter with a man who could ride fast and avoid bright pennons because the quickest way to make a letter false is to parade it. When the Tyrells flowered across the city, Sansa walked between blooms like a plant not yet selected for transplant. Marjorie smiled at her in ways that made Sansa feel seen. That was dangerous. Things that saw you could name you. Names had power. Sansa had learned this from a dancing master and from a dwarf and from the queen who thought herself the author of all other people's chapters. When Sansa sat beside Tyrion at a feast and watched Joffrey make a spectacle of mangers and meat, she felt a little heat in her palm and realized Tyrion's hand had found hers under the table. It stayed there not because he claimed anything, but because he wanted to anchor her to something that was not ugliness. She let it remain. The wine tasted like old apples. The music that night had an edge in it. She could not have named it then. Later, when people said purple, she would think of that edge, the moment when joy is too neatly harangued, and therefore likely to snap. Cersei asked her father for the world. As always, he gave her strategy instead of comfort. It infuriated her the way a splinter under the nail does when you have to sit at table and smile. He relocated the board, took pieces from her and arranged them so that when she moved, they scratched places she had not expected to be raw. He announced that his son would wed a rose. He announced that his other son would be of less use in rooms with light. He did not announce that he intended to bind the North with marriage and a paper claim. He sent ravens that landed like knives in men's laps. He thought he could outwait winter. Many men think they can. When Joffrey choked, it happened in a courtyard where the sun had been coaxed to look like mercy. People had dressed as if celebration wrapped their sins in silk. The cup clattered, and the boy who had made Sansa's heart a small frightened animal clawed his own throat as if digging would find the air hiding under skin. People shouted because people always do when something goes wrong in public. Cersei's scream was a mother's and a queen's and a child's all at once, the kind of sound that makes even enemies want to lift their hands. Tyrion's hand was still in Sansa's when the cup fell. It twitched as if of its own accord and then withdrew because he had learned, better than most, how quickly the world changes the meaning of a touch. The city closed its mouth like a trap. Sansa moved because Littlefinger had made a plan inside a plan and had put her into it as a jewel and as a wedge. She stepped through a door that had not been a door until a moment earlier and found herself on stone so narrow that her fear had to go thin to fit along with her. She looked once back at the hall where she had learned to cut meat in strips. Tyrion, surrounded by men whose loyalty had the shape of obedience, did not cry out to her. He had done everything he could for a bird he had not asked to hold. He did not try to fly with broken wings. He waited. Cersei named him Kinslayer and Kingslayer and other words that would stick like burrs until someone pulled them out. He thought of his father and the bathroom and a crossbow he'd never held. He did not think of killing anyone. He thought of the look on Sansa's face when he'd let go. Sometimes that is the only thought that keeps a man from being what others think he must be. Sansa crossed water that smelled like secrets and was cold in a way that made bones feel older. The ship leaned. Littlefinger's smile sat in the shadows like a cat that has eaten once and intends to eat again. "You are safe," he said. It made Sansa want to jump into the bay. She did not. She knew that the world had not intended this for her and that she would have to intend something back at it. One day, she watched his hands when he talked. She watched the way he counted other people's weaknesses like coins. She learned to tuck her own deep enough that even he would need to dig and scrape and perhaps get tired before he got all the way down. Word of Joffrey's death came to Robb like cold water, and he reacted as one does when doused. A shock, a gasp, a moment of rage at the chill. Not because he loved the boy, because destabilized kings made war a new thing every hour. He rechecked positions. He wrote to men who had thought to sit a week and found they would be asked to sit a month. He sent envoys to White Harbor again and to Bear Island because a rumor had come of a pink letter, and he recognized Roose Bolton's raw-boned pen even when it tried to wear another man's face. Bolton stood at his elbow with the precise blankness of a man who could watch a king's hand for tremor without letting his own quiver. Robb began to ask one more question of himself whenever Bolton spoke. What does he eat out of my words? Brienne of Tarth, who had loved a king for his kindness and lost him to a shadow cast by a brother, walked south with her grief turned into something like a blade. She had escaped accusation because there had been no one to accuse her who valued the truth over the convenience of a culprit at hand. She had not run. She had moved. She had fought when she needed to and walked when she could. She found Lord Edmure's men by a stream where fish leapt in a way that made her think of Renly's laugh. They took her because tall women in armor are as rare as dragons and more useful. She stood in a hall with tapestries that showed river scenes and asked to be sent to those who valued vow-keeping. Edmure was a kind man, but the world had taken away the shape in which kindness could rule. He sent her to Robb because he thought she might be a lesson in the old ways or a knife for a new one. Robb looked at her across the table and saw something that looked like a shield with a person's face. "I can fight," she said simply, "and I do not lie." He took her because in a world with more lies than bread, you keep the one person who has sworn off them even if you don't yet know where to place them on your board. She took bread with Jaime because fate enjoys irony. He goaded. She did not give him the satisfaction of flinching. She had come to hate and had found that vengeance did not fit her like armor. To fit her like a hair shirt, she still wore it. She watched him contemplate a life made of 12 steps, 12 back, and felt a small, strange stir of pity. It was not for what he had been. It was for what a cell makes. In the camps beneath the neck, the wolves learned new tricks. The phrase came and went with food that filled bellies and chatter that filled tents. Walder Frey's sons were smoothed in front of and rough behind. They brought news in dribs and drebs. One day, a rider with a Fry badge but a new horse brought 3 words that turned the air colder even without snow. Tywin is dead. The message unrolled like this. A wedding with purple, a pointing finger, a trial, a father with plans for his least loved son that involved a no. Oaths more subtle than any rope, a crossbow, a privy. The details were told and retold until truth and malice laid together like dogs. Robb listened only long enough to measure the hole the Lannister patriarch would leave. "Beware a lioness with cubs and no lion," the great Jon said, half in relish, half in warning. Tyrion escaped the city in a cloak that smelled like secrets and rot and blood. Varys's whisper had made a tunnel a road. He left behind a sister with a grievance that would not age well, a city that would find a new way to be ugly by morning, a wife gone like a breath, a father he had killed and would carry like a stone in his belly. He went east because people who have made monsters of themselves for love or for pride or for both often think the sea is a baptism. He did not believe in rebirth. He believed in boats, wine, and making himself useful to men who did not yet know that they needed someone who could arrange words and numbers and knives. Jon Snow stood upon the ice and heard the horn's third call and thought, "This is what cold actually means. It means something else is walking because life itself breathes in shallow gasps." He had a red-haired girl's wind in his chest and a black-haired boy's honor in his bones, and a wild man's freedom knotted around his heart. He fought when it was time to stop thinking. He remembered Corin and what the man had said he must do. He found himself with a sword in his hand that had been named and will be named again by other men if he lived long enough to watch it pass. When Stannis came down on the camp like a winter his men had chosen, he felt a strange, treacherous wash of relief. He did not love kings. He loved the idea that someone else might stand and be struck in his place for a day while he caught breath. Stannis wrote to the north as if it were a fortress he intended to take by starvation. He asked for fealty and offered justice and board and law as bread. Men in the north looked at their empty barns, their sons' graves, their daughters with new mouths to feed, and thought, law is not a blanket. It is a structure, and in snow structures crack. Some bent, some did not. Stannis found it easier to command men who had already longed to be commanded. He did not find it easy to make his black fire warm the rooms of those who had once warmed themselves over old gods' faces. Bran came to a cave where the air seemed to come from the bones of the world. Inside, a man with hair the color of spiderwebs and roots growing around his ankles spoke in a voice that sounded like wind through the reeds on the far side of a lake. It could reach you if you leaned your ear. "You are late," the man said. "You will be early for something else." Bran sat where he was told and closed his eyes and found that when he opened them again, the world had the same pieces and new meanings. He looked backward and saw a girl at a tower with a wet sword and a face that would not leave him. He looked forward and saw a tree bleeding and men kneeling and then not men at all. He found his mother beneath leaves more than under earth. He found that love, once carved into a tree, speaks in storms. He kept some of it for himself because he understood now that every gift you received from the old gods demanded a tithe. Arya, washed and stripped and called a new name by a city that measures people by their yews and their swords, refused to give up the thing in her that kept a gallery of faces in its pocket and touched them at night. She could not be anyone until she knew who had been killed by her names and her choices. She told herself she was emptying herself of Stark, but she knew that was a lie. She was storing it differently. That is not the same as cutting it out. Robb met Stannis' envoys in a cold hall and listened to them offer him the chance to fold his crown into another man's. He did not need to look at his wife to know how her face answered the question. He looked at his men instead, the great Jon with his bolder laugh, Bolton with his precise mouth, Manderly's man with his careful fat boy smile, Meej Mormont's girl with the eyes of a spear. He answered for all of them because that is what a king is, the mouth that takes responsibility for other people's eyes. "We will fight the night with you," he said. "We will bring wood and men and turnips and blood. The North does not kneel to a man who learned of us from a book. When the wall needs us, it will have us. When a throne needs us, it will hear the sound our banners make in the wind and understand that sound is not for them." Stannis' men bowed like iron bars reluctantly made to bend. They left messages behind that would grow colder as winter thickened. With Tywin dead, Cersei built her realm out of fear, wine, and rumor. It was a fragile architecture. It required constant attention. It required sometimes that she strike out at those who had only been standing where a slice of light fell. She chased Tyrion's shadow from hall to hall and found nothing but her own mistakes. She punished those within reach. She would, in time, punish the city that had made her queen. She could not help herself. She had been taught that power was the only blanket that kept cold from the bones. She could no more give it up than a child can choose hunger over bread. Sansa learned snows she had never known in the Vale. She learned wind that did not respect hair or titles. She learned to make her voice a small steady thing and to make her lies kinder than other people's truths. She became a Lane Stone and found that bastardy can be a cloak warmer than silk when men are trying to look through you and find the jewels. Littlefinger taught her accounts as if he were making her a ledger, not a person. She learned because a person who cannot count cannot plan. She hid the thing in her that glowed like a coal in a bankside fire and waited for when she could blow on it and make it eat. She thought sometimes of the woman who had shown her how to bind a wound and how to undo bread with a knife so it didn't crumble. She kept her mother's voice in a hidden pantry. Robb's war shifted as wars do when their original reasons are stabbed and left by the road. He fought more to keep men fed and less to decide which banners flew from crenels. He made truces that looked ugly when written and wise when lived. He broke small things to save larger ones. He slept less. He laughed sometimes, and when he did it was bright and quick as a spark thrown from a smith's hammer. His wife gave him a son with eyes like the winter sky on a day when the wind has made a clear plain of the air. He held the boy and felt something in him loosen that he had kept tightly bound since the courtyard in Winterfell. He whispered a name only he and she would know until it was said to a god. He considered naming him Eddard and stopped himself. The names of ghosts have weight. He chose a wolf's name and smiled into the baby's hair. News of Bran came to him like a rumor told by a drunk that later turned out to be true. He laughed aloud for the first time in weeks, a sound that made men in the hall look up, startled and then pleased by reflex. He wrote letters he knew would not find his brother, to send joy into the air anyway, as if joy were a raven that did not need training. He sent men to the wall with orders that sounded like prayers and like hedgemaths both. If he lives, get him warm. If he lives, remind him that we are a word that means more than blood. If he lives, tell him everything. Jaime's exchange came not as parchment but as sweat and blood. He rode out of a northern camp with a small escort on a cold morning that did not yet smell of snow. He did not get far before men in rough, stiff leather appeared from a copse, and what had been arranged on paper became something else under trees. He lived because he could not help it. He lived because Brienne swung her sword as if she were trying to cut through her own past. He lived and rode to King's Landing with a woman whose vows were her architecture. He felt the weight of his handlessness before he knew it. After he felt that too, he thought of Catelyn Stark again and did not enjoy what his mind did with that thought. He found his sister. He found his house altered. He found that, in his absence, the city had learned new ways to humiliate itself. He looked at his nephew on a bier and did not weep. He had learned to keep salt for his own wounds. He stood in the Kingsguard White and thought, what do I guard now, exactly? Roose Bolton gathered men in the Dreadfort and taught them that patience was a predator. He wore loyalty to the direwolf as one might wear a cloak with a moth hole at the hem. Presentable, not warm. He sent letters that implied and never stated. He sent men to Winterfell to see how much of its bones remained. He sent his bastard to do work better done at night. He waited. He saw that the Frey alliance had made one road impassable. He began to look for another road with the deliberation of a man choosing a knife from a tray. Mance Rayder's fire lifted smoke full of stories, dead leaves, fat. He wanted to take the wall and pull it down with his hands as if that were the root of all the South's cruelty. He found himself in iron. He told Jon Snow a thing that was half threat and half lesson. Every wall keeps two things apart that might be better in one field. Jon answered with a thing he had learned in rooms full of black men who did not want him. Sometimes a wall keeps a dead thing from eating a living one. He wore command like a coat that had not been cut for him. Sleeves too long, shoulders too tight. He learned to tailor it while men watched him do it. He won a vote he did not ask for. He read a letter in pink that made him smile a smile that did not reach his eyes. He wrote one back that was a trap for a man who believed the world to be made of traps he'd set himself. Stannis found in Jon a version of the North he could tolerate, hard, straight, unyielding. He found in the North a version of himself he did not like, cold, careful, calculating. He burned men and saved men and looked at himself afterward with the same hard eyes he had for everything else. He asked Robb again to bend. Robb sent men to the wall instead. The ravens went back and forth until their wings ached. The old gods watched without blinking. There were smaller stories that made the big ones possible. An old woman in a village near the Green Fork kept a hut warm with dung and gave a hungry boy a bowl of turnip soup and a word that made him choose to stay and mend fences instead of robbing a traveler the next morning. A maester in White Harbor wrote "Seed is strong" into a margin and did not know who would read it. A sellsword in the Vale taught a girl to throw a knife with either hand, and the girl kept the fewer-fingered throw for the day when a man with a little mockingbird pin came too close. A miller's wife looked at a man in a flayed man's colors and saw the emptiness in his eyes and hid her girl under the floor. She died for it. The girl lived. She grew up strangling chickens and then men. One night, when the snow hurried down and the canvas sang, Robb walked out into the cold alone and lifted his chin to let the flakes sting his face. He did not ask the gods anything. He did not make bargains. He stood and let winter claim him for a few breaths because he knew that if he did not make room for it, it would come and take rooms in him uninvited. He thought of his mother in a shape that was not pain for the first time in months, of her hands spreading a blanket, of her laugh when Arya ran with one boot and lost the other, of her stillness when listening. He said thank you into the dark. Gray wind rose from shadow and put his head against Robb's thigh. Together they stood there and breathed until the cold felt less like a knife and more like a truth. And south of him, in a city with 1,000 narrow eyes, Tyrion Lannister watched a foreign shore draw a line across a sea that did not care who lived and died upon it. He thought of towers and the people who fell from them and the ones who threw and the ones who caught. He thought of a woman under a tree. He raised his cup and drank to the fact that the world was full of accidents dressed in intention's clothes. Bran reached farther. His vision slid along the bark of trees and under door lintels and over the shoulders of men who had learned not to look up. He saw a man in a suit of red armor who did not bend. He saw a woman in a blue dress counting debts like rosary beads. He saw his sisters as if through ice, one learning to be no one so she could return as someone else entirely, one choosing when to be seen. He learned that knowing is not the same as helping, that watching can be mercy and cruelty both. He learned restraint in the same breath as he learned power. No one had taught him that when his mother lived. He thought she would have if she had stayed. Cersei set her son on a throne and called him king and smiled with a crack in it. She wrote to Highgarden with flattery and to the Iron Bank with promises and to herself with wine. She told herself the story of a woman wronged by a world made for men. Some lines were true, others were embroidered. She had been a bright-haired girl once. She had believed that being loved by something golden made you invincible. She had not been wrong exactly, but she had not been careful about the price. Roose Bolton sharpened a knife very slowly. He thought of a hall full of song and knives and wondered if it would ever be his to make. The phrase shared stew with him and did not know whether to be glad or afraid. Sometimes the people you keep near as allies are the ones you fear will sit at your table when you are not awake to watch where their hands go. Walder Frey, old and patient, counted offspring, alliances, coins, walls, and grudges. He counted days too. He felt that there would be fewer left than he would like. He decided to spend them like a man spends the last chestnuts in a winter seldom kind. Jon sent a letter north to a boy who had once played at swords on walls and had fallen and had found fire in roots. Said, "Winter is not the enemy. Hunger is. Cold is. The dead are. If you can help me, do. If you cannot, stay alive. If I die, remember me, but not too much." Bran read it in a cave and smiled because he had already remembered too much and found a way to live anyway. Sansa stood on a high winter balcony and breathed air that hurt. And for the first time since she had been a girl picking flowers along a river that was too wide to jump across, she felt something like the beginning of a plan that was not given to her by a man with soft hands and cunning eyes. She would have to walk through her fear the way one walks through tall grass, pushing it aside, letting seeds stick to her skirts, knowing snakes might be in it. She would do it. She would do it because every lesson she had been given, even the ugly ones, had taught her that to be a lady is to survive and make the room in which survival does not feel like failure. Robb took counsel with women as well as men because his mother had done so and because he had discovered that war is not fought only by those who wear steel. The widow who ran a bakehouse near the fords told him which messengers could be bribed and which would rather starve. Meage Mormont told him how bears fight when they cannot win, where they choose to bleed. His wife told him where he gave himself away when he said the word must. And he grew quieter when he used it. He learned to be a king in action, not in crown. He learned to sit awkwardly and to stand rightly. The river moved under the castle, stubborn and cold. It would outlast them all, and that knowledge did not make anyone stop fighting, only fight with more care. Winter was not done. War was not either. The story had learned to go on without the woman who had drawn its circle in a northern hall and kept the fire tended. But in every decision, in every breath a son took, in every letter a father would never read, in every choice the daughters made when no one was watching, you could hear her name. Not spoken, never writ, but present. A thread that did not break even when men's swords tried to cut it.